There was a time, before the world burned, when young men in Japan believed that spirit could defeat steel. They knelt in silent rows before the rising sun, their freshly sharpened bayonets gleaming like promises, their voices rising in unison to chant words that meant honor, sacrifice, death without surrender. The imperial military had built its doctrine on something older than gunpowder, older than empire itself, the conviction that will, properly cultivated and utterly committed, could overcome any material force. Bushido was not just a code. It was a metaphysics. A religion of the blade. They trained their soldiers to charge through fire, to embrace death as a lover, to believe that courage was its own armor. The soul, they taught, was the ultimate weapon. Half a world away, on a farm in Missouri or Alabama or Wisconsin, a different kind of man cleaned a different kind of weapon. No ceremony. No poetry. Just the simple mechanical task of breaking down a Winchester Model 97 pump-action shotgun, wiping the barrel clean of duck blood and feathers, oiling the action. This was a tool for killing birds and deer, for feeding families, for protecting livestock from coyotes in the night. There was no philosophy attached to it. No honor. Just utility. The man who held it did not think of himself as a warrior. He thought of himself as practical. These two worlds, one of transcendent faith, one of earthbound pragmatism, were about to collide in the green hell of the Pacific, and only one of them would survive intact. The first night they truly met was on Guadalcanal, in August of 1942, when the jungle itself seemed to breathe with malice. The air was so thick with humidity that men felt they were drowning even as they stood. Mosquitoes formed clouds so dense they looked like smoke. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and in the darkness between the trees, every shadow could be death. The Marines had landed thinking they were invading an island. What they found was that the island was invading them, crawling into their boots, rotting their socks, breeding fungus in their skin, filling their ears with the constant high whine of insects that never, ever stopped. The Japanese soldiers came in the night, as they always did. They had trained for this. The silent approach through darkness, the sudden explosion of violence at close range, the ecstasy of steel meeting flesh. They believed in the night attack as an article of faith, believed that American soldiers, soft and individualistic, would break and run when confronted with the intimacy of death delivered by hand. They came forward chanting, sometimes screaming, their bayonets fixed, their minds fixed on the moment of contact when spirit would prove superior to matter, when death itself would become a kind of victory. Then the jungle exploded with sound. The Winchester 97 was not a sophisticated weapon. It was a tube of steel that fired 9.33 caliber lead pellets with each pull of the trigger. But it had one feature that turned it from a hunting tool into something apocalyptic: the slam fire mechanism. A Marine could hold the trigger down and simply work the pump, and the gun would fire again and again, as fast as his arm could move, turning a single soldier into a wall of lead. In the absolute darkness of the jungle night, when you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, when the enemy was a sound and a smell and a shape moving through the undergrowth, the shotgun became the only truth that mattered. The sound was different from rifle fire. Deeper. Fuller. Less a crack than a roar, a physical punch to the air that you felt in your chest. And what it did to human bodies at close range was not like a rifle wound. It was erasure. At 15 feet, 9 pellets spread into a pattern the size of a dinner plate, and where that pattern touched flesh, flesh ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The Japanese soldiers, trained to endure pain, trained to fight through wounds, trained to die with dignity, found themselves facing something their training had not prepared them for. There was no dying with dignity when a shotgun blast caught you in the chest. There was just sudden absence, sudden transformation from man to meat. The myth of spiritual invincibility began to crack that night on Guadalcanal. Not all at once. Not obviously. But in the moments after those first shotgun blasts, in the confusion and the screaming and the sudden realization that courage meant nothing against 9 pieces of lead traveling at 1,200 feet per second, something fundamental shifted. The Japanese soldiers had been taught that they were special, that their willingness to die made them superior to the Americans who supposedly loved life too much. But the shotgun killed without caring about philosophy. It killed Democrats and fascists with equal indifference. It killed the faithful and the fearful. It killed spirit itself. The Marines who carried those shotguns were not heroes in the classical sense. They were farmers and hunters, men who had grown up with long guns, who knew instinctively how to lead a target, how to estimate range by feel. They had carried pumped shotguns through cornfields and duck blinds since childhood. The weapon felt natural in their hands in a way that the heavy, awkward Springfield rifle never quite did. In the jungle, at night, when the enemy was close enough to smell, these men became what they had always been, hunters. Except now the game fought back, and the stakes were everything. The weapon itself was a relic, in a way. The Winchester Model 97 had been designed in 1897 by John Moses Browning, perhaps the greatest firearms designer who ever lived. It had seen service in the trenches of World War I, where it earned the nickname, trench broom, for its ability to clear confined spaces. The Germans had protested its use, claimed it was inhumane, a violation of the laws of war. The Americans had ignored them. War, after all, was not about humanity. It was about winning. By the time of the Pacific Campaign, the Model 97 was obsolete by military standards. The newer Winchester Model 12 and the Stevens 520-30 had improved designs, better reliability. But the old 97 remained in service because it worked, and because in war, working was more important than perfect. The Marines modified them, shortening the barrels to 20 inches for easier handling in dense jungle. They wrapped the exposed metal in cloth to prevent reflections. They learned to load them in absolute darkness by feel, 6 shells in the tube magazine, 1 in the chamber. They learned the rhythm of the pump, the small pause needed to chamber a round cleanly. They learned that the weapon would fire from any position, standing, kneeling, prone, even held sideways if necessary. But more than the mechanics, what made the shotgun devastating was psychological. The Japanese military had built an entire doctrine around close combat, around the belief that in the intimate space of hand-to-hand fighting, their superior spirit would prevail. The banzai charge was not just a tactic. It was a statement of faith. When Japanese soldiers fixed bayonets and charged, they were not simply trying to kill the enemy. They were trying to prove something about the nature of reality itself, that the immaterial could dominate the material, that belief could overcome bullets. The shotgun destroyed that faith with brutal efficiency. A banzai charge was meant to be intimate, personal, a test of courage. But courage meant nothing when you were hit by a shotgun at 20 feet. You didn't have time to be brave. You didn't have time to think about the emperor or honor or the destiny of the Yamato race. You just disintegrated, and the men behind you saw it happen, saw their comrade transformed in an instant from a warrior into scattered pieces, and no amount of spiritual training could prepare you for that. The irony was bitter. Here was the Japanese military, which prided itself on the samurai tradition, on the nobility of the sword, being destroyed by what was essentially a peasant's weapon. A gun for killing ducks. A gun that American farmers used to protect their chickens from foxes. There was no honor in it, no artistry. It was pure function, pure practicality, pure American industrial pragmatism. And it worked. But the shotgun represented only about 2% of all firearms issued to Marines in the Pacific. It was never a primary weapon, never issued to entire units. It was a specialist tool, carried by scouts, point men, tunnel rats, the soldiers who knew they would be fighting at ranges measured in feet, not yards. For every Marine carrying a Winchester 97, there were 50 carrying M1 Garands or bars or carbines. Yet the psychological impact of that 2% was disproportionate. The Japanese soldiers learned to fear the distinctive sound of the pump action in the darkness, the deep boom that meant death was immediate and total. Then came New Guinea, and the jungle proved it had lessons for everyone. If Guadalcanal had been hell, New Guinea was hell's basement, flooded and forgotten. The fighting there stretched from 1942 through 1945, across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Mountains that went straight up into clouds. Swamps that swallowed men whole. Rain that fell not in drops but in solid walls of water, day after day, week after week. The jungle was so dense that visibility dropped to arm's length. The heat was so extreme that metal burned to touch. And the humidity destroyed everything. The shotgun shells were paper. Waxed cardboard, technically, with a brass base, but still fundamentally paper. In the swamps of New Guinea, paper became a sick joke. The shells swelled with moisture. They expanded in the magazine tubes, jamming the action. When they did chamber, they often failed to eject, the soggy cardboard catching on the extractor. And when they fired, if they fired, the powder sometimes didn't ignite completely, producing weak, erratic blasts that barely cycled the action. The Marines learned to hate their shotguns in New Guinea. Men who had trusted the weapon on Guadalcanal now found themselves in firefights with a useless tube of steel in their hands, desperately working the pump while the action jammed again and again. They tried everything. They wrapped the shells in oilcloth. They carried them in rubber pouches. They coated them in grease, in wax, in anything that might keep the moisture out. Nothing worked for long. In that environment, water was inevitable. It seeped into everything, corrupted everything, turned everything organic into rot and everything metal into rust. There were battles in New Guinea where Marines threw away their shotguns and picked up captured Japanese rifles just to have something that functioned. The weapon that had seemed so devastating on Guadalcanal now became a liability, dead weight on a march that was already killing men through exhaustion and disease. The jungle was the real enemy in New Guinea, and it proved that American technology had limits. Faith in steel could fail just as certainly as faith in spirit. The fighting in New Guinea was different from Guadalcanal. Less dramatic. More grinding. Men died not in glorious charges but from infected wounds, from malaria, from dysentery that emptied them out from the inside. They died from exhaustion, simply lying down on the trail and not getting up. They died from accidents, drowning in rivers, falling from mountain paths, being crushed by falling trees. The Japanese died the same way, by the thousands, their supply lines cut, their soldiers reduced to skeletons stumbling through the jungle, eating roots and bark and, sometimes, each other. The shotgun became almost irrelevant in this kind of war. What mattered was the ability to keep moving, to keep the supply lines open, to keep the men fed and the equipment dry. The Americans won in New Guinea not because of superior weapons but because of superior logistics, because they could fly in supplies over the mountains, because they had the ships and planes and trucks and the endless industrial capacity to keep their soldiers equipped. The Japanese, spiritually committed to dying in place, logistically unable to sustain their positions, died in place. Tens of thousands of them, disappearing into the jungle, becoming part of it, their bones mixing with the mud. By the time the New Guinea campaign wound down in 1945, the shotgun had been largely phased out of jungle warfare. It had proven too unreliable, too vulnerable to the environment. But war, like water, finds new channels. Manila, in February 1945, was where the shotgun had its resurrection. The city was being destroyed room by room, building by building. The Japanese had decided to defend it to the death, even though MacArthur had declared it an open city, even though doing so meant the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Filipino civilians. The Japanese soldiers and sailors fortified the ancient Spanish buildings of Intramuros, the walled city within the city, and prepared for a siege. Urban warfare is intimate in a way that even jungle combat is not. In the jungle, there is space, distance, the possibility of concealment. In a city, especially in the rubble of a city being systematically destroyed by artillery, combat happens at arm's length. Rooms. Hallways. Staircases. Around corners where you have a half-second to determine if the shape in front of you is enemy, or civilian, or your own man covered in dust. Here, the shotgun found new purpose. In a darkened room full of smoke and plastered dust, when you kick down a door and have no idea what's behind it, a shotgun is the only weapon that makes sense. You don't aim. You point. You fire. And whatever is in front of you ceases to be a threat. The Marines learned to move through buildings in pairs, one man with a rifle for distance, one with a shotgun for close quarters. They learned to fire blind around corners, the shotguns spread compensating for lack of precision. They learned to clear rooms by sound, listening for breathing, for the small shuffle of movement, then firing through walls. The fighting in Manila was apocalyptic. The city burned for weeks. Civilians huddled in basements while artillery tore apart the buildings above them. The Japanese soldiers, knowing they were doomed, killed indiscriminately, taking their rage out on the population they claimed to be liberating from American imperialism. Whole families were executed. Women were raped and murdered. Babies were bayoneted. The city that had once been called the Pearl of the Orient became a charnel house, a place where humanity went to die. The Marines who fought through Manila were no longer the fresh-faced recruits who had landed on Guadalcanal. They were hard men now, tired men, men who had seen too much to believe in anything except getting through the next hour. The shotgun in their hands was just a tool, no different from the entrenching tool they used to dig fighting positions, or the K-bar knife they used to open rations. There was no glory in firing it. No satisfaction. Just the mechanical process of survival, repeated endlessly, until either you stopped or the enemy stopped. In the ruins of Intramuros, surrounded by the bodies of civilians and the rubble of 400-year-old churches, the shotgun did its work. It cleared rooms where Japanese soldiers waited with grenades. It swept staircases where snipers crouched in the darkness. It killed at ranges so close that the muzzle flash left powder burns on the target. And when the battle finally ended, when the last Japanese soldier was dead and the city was silent except for the crackling of fires and the moaning of the wounded, the Marines who had carried those shotguns simply moved on to the next objective. There was always a next objective. Iwo Jima, in February and March of 1945, was where the shotgun finally became obsolete, its limitations laid bare by the nature of the terrain and the enemy's tactics. The island was 8 square miles of volcanic ash and rock, dominated by Mount Suribachi on the southern end and a plateau of broken ground to the north. The Japanese had spent months fortifying it, digging tunnels and bunkers deep into the rock, creating an underground fortress connected by miles of passageways. They had learned the lessons of previous battles, had abandoned the banzai charge in favor of defense in depth, had prepared to kill Americans not with courage but with patience and preparation. The Marines landed expecting the worst and somehow still were not prepared. The beach was black volcanic sand that gave way beneath boots, making every step an exhausting struggle. The Japanese had zeroed their artillery and mortars on every inch of the landing zones, and as the Marines came ashore, the island itself seemed to explode. There was no cover on the beach, nowhere to hide, just the black sand and the shells falling like rain and men dying in windows, in groups, entire squads wiped out in seconds. The shotgun was useless here. The Japanese were underground, protected by tons of rock and concrete. They fought from pillboxes with firing slits barely wide enough for a rifle barrel. They emerged from hidden entrances, fired, then disappeared back into the earth before the Marines could respond. This was not a war of close combat and sudden encounters. This was a war of flamethrowers and satchel charges, of tanks and artillery, of engineers with explosives crawling up to bunker entrances and sealing them shut with whoever was inside. The Marines who had carried shotguns on previous islands found themselves carrying different weapons on Iwo. Flamethrowers became the primary close combat tool, spewing jellied gasoline into bunker openings, burning the air itself, suffocating the men inside. Demolitions teams used shaped charges and Bangalore torpedoes to collapse tunnel entrances. Tanks fired directly into firing slits at point-blank range. The fighting was methodical, systematic, grinding. Every yard of ground cost lives. Every pillbox was a problem to be solved with explosives and fire. The Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima were not the same men who had charged with bayonets on Guadalcanal. They had learned that courage alone was not enough, that spirit could not stop bullets or bombs. They fought with cold calculation, making the Americans pay for every foot of rock. They understood that they were going to die, that the island could not be held, but they could make the conquest so expensive that the Americans would think twice about invading the homeland. And they nearly succeeded. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only about 200 survived to be captured. The rest died in place, in their bunkers, in their tunnels, buried alive or burned alive or simply fighting until there was no one left to fight. The Americans suffered over 26,000 casualties, nearly 7,000 killed. It was the only battle in the Pacific where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties, and it shocked the American command. If a small volcanic rock cost this much, what would the invasion of Japan itself require? The answer to that question would eventually involve atomic weapons, but before that decision was made, there was one more island. Okinawa, from April to June 1945, was the last and largest battle of the Pacific War. The island was large enough to support a substantial civilian population, which meant the fighting happened not just in jungles and beaches but in villages and towns, among people who had nowhere to flee. The Japanese strategy was familiar by now: defense in depth, underground fortifications, a willingness to fight until literally everyone was dead. But there was a new element of desperation, a sense that this was truly the last stand before the homeland itself was invaded. The shotgun made a brief reappearance on Okinawa, but it was a shadow of its former self. The paper shells had been replaced with brass-cased ammunition, solving the humidity problem that had plagued the weapon in New Guinea. But the men who carried them were different now. They were not hunters proving themselves in combat. They were exhausted veterans fighting in a war that seemed to have no end. The shotgun was just another tool, no more significant than a bayonet or a grenade. The fighting on Okinawa was characterized by rain. It rained for days without stopping, turning the island into a sea of mud. Men fought in water up to their knees. Equipment bogged down. Tanks sank into the mud and had to be abandoned. The Japanese defenders, entrenched in caves and tunnels, waited out the worst of it underground, then emerged to kill the Marines struggling through the mire. The civilian casualties on Okinawa were catastrophic. Caught between the two armies, subjected to Japanese propaganda that told them the Americans would rape and murder them all, many chose suicide. Entire families jumped from cliffs. Parents killed their children, then themselves. Others were executed by Japanese soldiers for attempting to surrender, for showing weakness, for acknowledging the reality that Japan was losing. By the time the battle ended, over 100,000 Okinawan civilians were dead, roughly a quarter of the island's population. The Marines who survived Okinawa were hollow men. They had been fighting for years, had seen too many friends die, had killed too many enemies. The shotgun that had once seemed like a revelation now seemed like a relic of a simpler time, when they had believed that the right weapon could solve any problem. They knew better now. They knew that war was not solved with weapons but with will, with the simple ability to keep functioning when everything in you wanted to stop. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the Marines preparing for the invasion of Japan felt not triumph but relief. They would not have to fight through the beaches again. They would not have to clear more cities room by room. They would not have to face the Japanese homeland defense, which intelligence suggested would be a nightmare of civilians armed with bamboo spears fighting alongside the military. The war was over, and they could finally stop. The Japanese doctrine of spiritual supremacy died not with the atomic bombs but in the thousands of small defeats that preceded them. It died on Guadalcanal when bayonet charges met shotgun blasts. It died in New Guinea when soldiers starved in the jungle. It died in Manila when the city they were defending burned around them. It died on Iwo Jima when their perfect underground fortress merely delayed defeat rather than preventing it. And it died on Okinawa when the last reserve of the empire was expended, and there was nothing left but surrender or extinction. The Americans won not because they were braver or more committed or more spiritual. They won because they had more factories, more ships, more planes, more everything. They won because they treated war as a problem to be solved rather than a test to be passed. They won because when something didn't work, like paper shotgun shells in humid jungles, they changed it, rather than demanding that reality conform to their expectations. They won because they were practical. But practical victories do not inspire poetry. There were no songs written about the Winchester Model 97, no monuments erected to the Marines who carried them. The weapon that had seemed so revolutionary in 1942 was forgotten by 1946, warehoused, eventually scrapped or sold to police departments for riot control. The men who had carried them went home and rarely spoke of what they had done. How do you explain to a civilian what it feels like to shoot a man at 10 feet with a shotgun? How do you describe the way the body comes apart, the way the sound echoes in a confined space, the way the smell stays with you? There is a Winchester 97 in a museum somewhere, behind glass, with a small placard explaining its use in the Pacific Theater. The wood is scarred, the metal pitted with rust. It looks like what it is, an old tool, obsolete, forgotten. But once, in the darkness of a Pacific jungle, that tool changed the course of battles. It killed the myth of invincibility. It proved that spirit, however refined, however committed, could not defeat 9 pellets of lead traveling at 1,200 feet per second. The Japanese soldiers who survived the war, the few who made it through the meat grinder of the Pacific, went home to a country they no longer recognized. The emperor, who they had believed was divine, announced his humanity in a radio broadcast, his voice thin and uncertain. The military, which had promised them glory, was dissolved. The ideology that had demanded they die rather than surrender was revealed as a lie, a manipulation, a way to extract obedience from young men who trusted their leaders. They had been told that spiritual purity could overcome material advantage, that faith was armor, that death was transcendence. Instead, they learned that death was just death, and it came for the faithful and faithless alike, distributed according to the logic of ballistics and logistics and industrial capacity. The American Marines went home too, to a country that celebrated them and did not understand them. They were heroes in the parades, but at night, alone, they remembered things that heroism could not encompass. They remembered the faces of the men they killed, close enough to see the expression in their eyes in the instant before the trigger pull. They remembered the civilians caught in the crossfire, the children's bodies in the ruins of Manila, the old men and women on Okinawa choosing death over surrender. They remembered the absolute arbitrary nature of survival, that they lived and their friends died for no reason, no plan, just luck and chaos. Some of them kept their shotguns, brought them home as souvenirs. They went back to hunting ducks and deer, using the same weapon that had killed men. The pump action felt the same. The weight was familiar. But something had changed. The weapon carried a memory now, a weight that had nothing to do with steel. Every time they worked the action, every time they fired, there was an echo of the jungle, of the screaming, of the bodies coming apart. Some of them sold the guns. Some of them threw them away. Some of them kept them locked in closets, and never touched them again. The shotgun itself, as an idea, as a symbol, faded from military use. By the Vietnam War, the pumped shotgun was a niche weapon, carried by MPs and tunnel rats but not by regular infantry. The rifle had become the primary weapon, the M16 and its variants, lighter and more controllable than the old M1 Garand. Warfare had evolved. Engagement ranges had increased. The intimate, close-quarters combat of the Pacific jungles was replaced by helicopter assaults and artillery bombardments, and smart bombs delivered from miles away. But there was a moment, in the early 1940s, when the shotgun mattered. When it was the weapon that broke the Japanese doctrine, that proved American pragmatism could defeat Japanese spiritualism, that showed courage was no match for industrial efficiency. It was not a long moment. Perhaps 3 years, from Guadalcanal to Manila. But in that moment, the humble pump-action shotgun, designed to kill birds, became the instrument that shattered an empire's faith in itself. Did we win because we were right? Because democracy is superior to fascism? Because freedom is stronger than tyranny? Or did we win simply because we had more guns, more ships, more bombs? Because we were willing to burn entire cities, to kill hundreds of thousands of civilians, to do whatever was necessary to achieve victory? The shotgun does not answer these questions. It merely executes them, indifferently, mechanically, turning philosophy into physics, turning ideas into consequences. There is no moral to this story, no lesson that makes sense of it all. War is not a fable. It does not teach clean lessons. It simply happens, like a storm, like a plague, and afterward, the survivors pick through the wreckage and try to build something from what remains. The Japanese learned that spiritual purity could not stop bullets. The Americans learned that victory does not feel the way they expected it to feel. Both sides learn that war consumes everything it touches, transforms everything it encounters, and the survivors are not the same people who began the fighting. The Winchester Model 97, that simple tube of steel, sits in its museum case and remembers nothing. It is not haunted. It does not dream. It is just metal and wood, assembled according to John Browning's genius, used according to practical necessity, and finally retired when it was no longer needed. But the men who carried it remember. They carry the memory in their bodies, in the way they startle at sudden sounds, in the way they wake at night sweating from dreams they cannot quite recall. They carry it in the silence they maintain when civilians ask them what it was like, knowing that there are no words adequate to the truth. The jungle has reclaimed Guadalcanal. The buildings of Manila have been rebuilt. Iwo Jima is a memorial, quiet and respectful. Okinawa is home to American military bases, an irony that history seems to specialize in producing. And somewhere in the depths of the ocean, in the wrecks of ships and planes, in the mud and coral, there are shotguns still, buried and forgotten, rusting away, becoming part of the geology. The war ended. The weapons were retired. The soldiers went home. And the myth of spiritual invincibility, the belief that faith could overcome force, died quietly in the decades that followed. Japan rebuilt itself as an industrial powerhouse, adopted democracy, became America's ally. The young men who had been taught to die for the emperor became salarymen, engineers, businessmen. They did not speak much about the war. They did not teach their children the old doctrines. The past became a foreign country, strange and incomprehensible. And in America, the shotgun remained what it had always been, a practical tool for practical purposes. A weapon for home defense, for hunting, for the police. Not romantic. Not heroic. Just functional. Which is, perhaps, the most American thing of all. The question remains, unanswered and unanswerable, in that moment of collision between faith and pragmatism, between spirit and steel, what was truly lost? The Japanese lost their empire, their ideology, their belief in their own specialness. But what did the Americans lose? Perhaps the illusion that victory brings satisfaction. Perhaps the belief that wars can be won cleanly, that the defeated are purely evil and the victors purely good. Perhaps something more fundamental, the ability to believe in anything beyond survival, beyond the practical, beyond the next objective. The shotgun does not care. It sits in its case, inert, waiting for nothing. But the men who carried it, the few who remain, sometimes look at their hands and remember the weight of it, the kick against their shoulder, the sound it made in the darkness. And they wonder, in moments they do not speak of, whether any of it meant anything beyond the moment. Whether the deaths they caused and witnessed and survived were part of some larger narrative, or just chaos, just violence, just the application of force to flesh until one side could no longer continue. There is no music swelling here, no triumphant end. Just the sound of waves against distant shores, washing over islands where the bones of young men still lie buried. Just the whisper of wind through trees that have grown over old battlefields. Just the slow, steady rust of metal returning to earth, the dissolution of all things back into elements, into dust. The war ended. The shotgun was retired. The myth died. And the world moved on, as it always does, leaving only memories and questions in its wake. Whether we won because we were strong or because we stopped believing in anything but strength is a question each survivor must answer for themselves. The shotgun, efficient and indifferent, offers no judgment. It simply was, and then it was not needed, and so it stopped. That is the story of the shotgun war. Not a story of glory, but of function. Not a story of triumph, but of exhaustion. Not a story that explains anything, but one that happened anyway, whether it made sense or not. The men who lived it are dying now, one by one, taking their memories with them. Soon there will be only the artifacts, the rusted weapons in museum cases, the photographs of young men who no longer exist. And the shotgun, that simple tool, will be remembered not for what it meant but for what it did. It killed efficiently, it broke the myth, and then it was set aside. The silence after the last shot is the longest silence of all. It stretches across decades, across oceans, across the space between what we hoped war would be and what it actually was. In that silence, there are no answers. Only the question that every survivor carries: was it worth it? And the knowledge that asking changes nothing, that the past cannot be unmade, that the dead remain dead regardless of what meaning we try to assign their deaths. The shotgun war is over. It has been over for 80 years. But its echoes remain, faint but persistent, in the way we understand ourselves, the way we remember, the way we try to explain the inexplicable. We won. They lost. That much is fact. Everything else, meaning, purpose, justice, is interpretation, and interpretations change with time and distance. The shotgun does not care about interpretation. It was built to function, and it functioned, and that is its entire story. And perhaps that is the only honest conclusion, that some stories resist meaning, resist closure, resist the narratives we try to impose on them. The shotgun war was fought, was won, and ended. What it meant is for each person to decide, and no decision changes what happened or brings back what was lost. The weapon sits in its case. The memories fade. The world continues. And somewhere in the Pacific, the waves continue their eternal work, washing over the places where young men once killed each other with absolute conviction that what they did mattered, that their cause was just, that victory would vindicate everything. The waves do not care about conviction or justice or vindication. They simply wash over everything, patient and indifferent, until even the memories are worn smooth, until even the questions lose their edges, until there is nothing left but the slow, steady transformation of all things into history, into silence, into dust.